Solution-focused brief therapy was developed by Steve DeShazer, Insoo Kim Berg, and their team at the world-famous Brief Family Therapy Center in Milwaukee, United States. While working with their clients, they discovered that it is not necessary to know all the details of a problem or to investigate into the cause of complaints or to ask about the symptoms of a diagnosis. They focused on the desired changes of the client rather than the problem history of the client. A respectful, goal-oriented approach was developed based on the collaboration with the client and the client's ideas rather than the insight of the therapist expert. The basic assumption held was that the client has the required knowledge, skills, and the resources to move towards their desired goal. The approach was developed in 1980s and ever since it has gained traction over years and has redefined the field of psychotherapy. The approach is not restricted to the field of therapy and social work. Hospital care, education, business, management, and many other fields are being inspired. Throughout the world, the approach has been applied by many professionals and more than 1900 books and articles are written in many languages around the world. As a psychotherapist, what attracted you to solution-focused approach?
Well, thank you for that question, Aishwarya, and thank you for coming over to be my
pleasure.
interviewer. You know, most psychotherapies are expert-driven and problem-focused. So now, what does it mean? It means that the therapist is the expert. So the therapist will help the client to get insights, to understand his or her problem.
Yes.
Like how the problem is related to childhood experiences, how it is related to life events, how it is related to psychosexual stages like Freudian psychology. So the therapist is the expert and the client is unknowing.
Yes.
And most psychotherapists, they work with DSM, you know,
Yes.
the book with
The
all
manual.
the manual. So I call that the dark side of man. So the therapist works with the DSM-5. So the therapist will focus on the symptoms of the behavior of the client, the symptoms of the problem, and he will make a diagnosis.
Yes.
So most psychotherapists work like that. This is most common around the world. So the therapist is the expert and also works problem focused. But not Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kim Berg. In the solution-focused approach, they work 180 degrees differently. So they don't dig into the problem, like you just said in your introduction. They don't dig into the problem,
Yes.
but they ask all these wonderful solution-focused questions. So they don't experience themselves as an expert, but they say the client is expert. The client has many ideas. So when I first heard about this and when I first saw them at work having conversations with their clients, it sounded like beautiful music to me. And you know, I'm a music lover. It just sounded like
Music.
yeah, like a fugue of Bach, or you know, or like a beautiful raga,
Okay.
like in your country, playing on the sarod or the sitar. It sounded like beautiful music.
Did you find out what they were doing differently?
Yes, and I was very lucky because Steve and Insoo came to the town where I was living, Utrecht. And they were actually teaching in a building next to the school of my kids. So I took my kids to school and I went to see them so I could study with them for many days.
That's nice.
And I found out that they were asking all these wonderful solution-focused questions like, suppose we have a good talk here, we have a good meeting, how would you know? Or how would you like your family or your relationship or your workspace to be? So they were helping the client to envision their desired changes. what they wanted instead of their problem. So I
Okay.
think this is the essence of the solution focused approach, to envision with the client what you want different in your life.
You have developed a conceptual framework with 5 principles. What is the importance of that framework?
I made it because I teach a lot, so I made it for my students.
Okay.
5 interrelated important principles about of the solution focused approach,
Okay.
so they could understand, from a helicopter view,
Okay.
what does it involve. Because everyone has heard of the scaling question and the miracle question and the coping questions. Those are interventions.
Mm.
But I wanted to make a framework of the important principles to
Okay.
understand the working of the solution focus approach.
Working of the interventions.
That's right.
Okay.
How they work.
Okay. Can you please explain about the first principle?
First, I've called towards desired changes. That's the first principle.
Okay.
And I asked a friend to make an illustration, a picture. And he made this wonderful illustration of a coachman sitting on a coach and pointing in a direction. So the solution-focused practitioner is like a coachman. He will ask the passenger, where do you want to go? Instead of where have you been before?
Okay.
So it's a goal-directed approach. And the effort is to find out where the client wants to go, what the client wants instead of the experienced problems. Shall I give you an example?
Please.
For instance, the client says, let's keep it simple. I'm very insecure. I feel so insecure, at my workplace, but also when I meet friends and in my family, I feel insecure. So a traditional therapist will dig into the insecurity. Where does it come from? What's the relation with the upbringing, with life events? So he will try to understand,
The history of the problem.
right, the cause of the problem, the cause of insecurity, the cause of feeling anxious. But not the solution-focused practitioner. Solution-focused practitioner will ask different questions. What would you like instead of the problem? How would you know that the problem is gone, and what's the difference? So the solution-focused practitioner will work towards a goal. For instance, feeling self-assured.
Okay.
So a lot of the conversation will be about feeling self-assured. What difference will that make in your life? How will your friends know that you are more self-assured? How will your family know? How will you know yourself? So the language of change is introduced all the time. So it's about change, and it's about working towards the preferred future of the client.
Mostly to the positive aspects rather than the negative aspects.
So then, yes, so then the conversation has more positive content instead of, when you dig into the problem, it has more negative content. So that's why the solution-focused conversations are more positive.
Can you please explain about the second principle?
Second principle is called activating clients' useful ideas. And in the United States, family therapy in the 1980s, there was a movement called post-structuralism or postmodernism. And they said, we don't like the normative ways of thinking of the therapist anymore, because the norm is very much white, middle class, heterosexual client. And we want a difference. We don't want the therapist to set the norm, but the client can decide how they want to live their lives. So the role of the therapist changed from expert to more facilitator about that time. This was a time that the solution-focused approach was developed by Steve and Insu. So the role of the therapist changed. Not so much expert anymore, but more facilitator. And they said, client is the expert. They can decide how they would live their lives. And so instead of giving advice to the client, they would ask all these questions to activate the ideas of the client. So the client was activated from the beginning of a conversation. And there was a basic assumption that the client has many useful ideas. Maybe not directly accessible for the client, but when we ask all these wonderful questions, then the client will get access to useful ideas. So the second principle, activating client.
Useful ideas.
Yes, so ask questions to activate your useful ideas.
So the first principle is about setting up a desired goal. The second principle is about activating the useful ideas of the client. What is the third principle about?
Third principle I've called working from a strengths-based perspective. So when you would speak to a client and when you put on your solution-focused glasses, you will see different things. You will see resources, you will see strengths, you will see resilience. You will highlight what's working for the client. So when you put on different glasses, you see different things. Eve Lipchick, famous American therapist, has called this listening with a constructive ear. So you listen to the client, but you listen with a constructive ear. Okay. And you will ask different questions. So you will give compliments, you will highlight what's working for the client, the successful strategies. You will highlight the successes in the past. You will highlight positive exceptions. And so that makes a difference. So it's working from a different perspective, strength-based perspective.
So it's actually giving them an idea about their own strength.
Their own strength, yes, yes. And maybe those experiences are not directly accessible, but when you focus on them in a conversation, they will show up. They will show
More
up.
visible then.
Yeah.
Can you now explain about the fourth principle?
Yes, fourth principle I've called the use of constructive language. So the SF practitioner uses constructive language instead of problem language.
Okay.
Can I give you an example?
Please.
Just this week I was talking to a mother and her 16-year-old son. And the mother said, you know, I have all this pain because my son has stolen money from me several times. So my own son has stolen money from me several times. And this hurts. And what also hurts is that he never admitted. And I'm sure he did it, but he never admitted. So when we had this conversation, I used different language, more constructive language. Instead of calling it stealing, I said to him, so you took money from your mother because somehow you needed it, and without her permission, without asking her. And then he said, yes, I did.
Okay.
And so instead of using the word stealing, of course he stole money from his mother, but I used different language. And it has a little bit less judgment, a bit less accusation.
Okay.
So then he opened up. He said, yes, I took money from my mother.
So he confessed.
He confessed. And then later in the conversation, we talked about a solution. So what will help? What will help to make it up with your mother? And what can help to how to deal with money for the near future? And then we had a useful conversation about it. And the mother was very relieved. So it's just an example how the use of certain words can make a difference, right?
Okay. So, how is Wittgensteinian philosophy related with this principle?
Ludwig Wittgenstein was a philosopher of logic, but also a philosopher of language.
Okay.
Philosopher of logic, so that's why Bertrand Russell became so interested in Wittgenstein, and he wanted him to work on the philosophy of logic. But Wittgenstein was also very interested in language.
Okay.
And he said language not only describes, but language creates. Language shapes our reality. Language shapes our experience. So the language we use determines how we observe also. And that's why Steve de Shazer got very interested in Wittgensteinian philosophy.
Okay.
So it's about the use of words.
Constructive words.
Yes, in the solution focus approach, we have a preference to use constructive language instead of problem language.
Okay.
Can I give you another example?
Yes.
This lady, my client, she says, I am not manic depressive, but I'm finding ways how to deal with my manic depressive problems.
Okay.
So instead of I am manic depressive,
Okay.
which points to her identity, she says, I'm finding ways.
Okay.
So she found wording herself,
Okay.
different language herself, and that's language. That's also constructive language.
Yes.
There's a Persian poet, he says, the words you use become the house you live in.
Yeah.
So when you use problem language in the conversation with your client, you create problem experiences.
Okay.
And when you use constructive language, you will create a constructive conversation.
Moving on to the last and the fifth principle, what's it about?
Fifth principle is about placing the solutions in a social context.
Okay.
So the SF psychology is rooted in systemic thinking,
Okay.
placing both problems and effective solutions in a social context, in a context of relationships with important others, and placing it also in the culture. So reality is socially constructed. You have learned to experience reality from significant other people.
Okay.
So that's why in the solution-focused conversations you will find a lot of relationship questions and interactional questions.
Okay.
So these are questions about the interpersonal dynamics. For instance, suppose you gain self-confidence and you stand up for yourself in a better way in the near future. How will your peers know about this? What will they notice differently about you? So placing the solutions in a social context.
Okay.
Another example, suppose you stand up for yourself in a better way, you are more assertive, you assert yourself. How will your spouse respond to this? That's an interactional question. So systemic thinking, interpersonal psychology. So you kind of involve significant other people in the conversation without them having to be there.
Okay. In their absence.
You can ask these questions in their absence.
Okay.
So still you will involve them by asking those interactional and relationship questions.
So, summarizing the 5 principles, I guess the first one is about setting up a preferred future. The second one is about activating the useful ideas of the clients with questions. The third one is about um, like giving importance to the strengths of the person, of the
Yes,
client.
yes.
And the fourth one is about using constructive language. And the fifth one is about involving important people in the session, important others in the session.
That's right.
So I guess that's the five principles about it.
That's right. Thank you very much. Aishwarya, thank you very much for a good interview. I enjoyed that.
Thank you so much, and thank you for enlightening about solution-focused therapy. And I'm sure I'm going to take this back to you.